Hey, you Stygian Dogs. What follows is a conversation that I'd been greatly anticipating, and with Howard Days just around the corner, it was all the more auspicious. If you're a regular reader of the monthly Conan the Barbarian series from Titan Comics and Heroic Signatures, or if you watch my reviews of the aforementioned, you'll be well aware of Jeffrey Shanks, whose essays have appeared in each issue of the series, including the 2 free comic book day issues. It's my observation that, especially early in the series relaunch, Shanks' essays did a lot to fortify Jim Zub's bold creative choices, adding context and rationale to the storytelling. To me, they're a must-read, full of excellent reference information, while being especially welcoming to those who are newer to Conan and Robert E. Howard. We start by talking about Jeff's day job as an archaeologist, his journey into Howard scholarship, and his relationship with Heroic Signatures, one that will now include comic writing credits in the Savage Sword of Conan #4. We go deep into Howard days, veer into the world of early fanzines. He tells us about the Holy Grail for Howard collectors, his archaeological dig at the Howard House, and so much more. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Conan compatriot and Nemedian scholar, Jeffrey Shanks. Jeffrey Shanks, how are you?
I am doing well. Thanks for having me, man. I've been wanting to come on Stygian Dogs for a while now. I'm a huge fan of your show, of your podcast.
No, I'm absolutely honored. And of course, viewers are going to know you from the monthly essay series, but how would you introduce yourself and describe what you do in your day job?
Well, in my day job, I'm an archaeologist. I've been a professional archaeologist for 20 something years. Been doing this for a while now. For many years, I was an archaeologist for a federal agency. More recently, I've jumped to the private sector. Currently, I'm working for a large national engineering company. They recruited me, brought me in to build an in-house cultural resources program, archaeology and historic preservation. So that's kind of exciting. So kind of a new phase in my career. But I'm a fancy ditch digger, basically.
I just on the topic of the private industry and hosting like a cultural heritage center or something like that. Is that a more common occurrence that we're seeing?
I mean, it is. A lot of the archaeology that gets done in North America, isn't always driven by research. It's driven by laws and federal regulations and state regulations and sometimes local ordinances that require you to do archaeology before large projects, right, where you could have an impact on significant historical sites or archaeological sites or structures or things like that. So that's what drives a lot of the archaeology in North America. Not as much research oriented as you might think, although of course that's a big part of it as well.
Oh, that's really interesting. And then as far as Conan goes, how were you first exposed to Conan? How did Conan come into your life?
All right, so we're going way back, long before the archaeology days. So I was very young when I was first introduced to Conan, and probably 6 thereabouts. And it was a lot of people get introduced to Conan, through the comics. That's a pretty common way, or through the Arnold film. For me, it was sort of a comic. It was one of the old Power Records comics. I don't know, some of your younger viewers or listeners may not remember these, but back in the 70s, we used to have record players, and I think it was Marvel and I think maybe DC as well teamed up with a company called Power Records, and they would do comics. It would come with a record in the back of them that would narrate the story of the comic. And there were a couple of Conan ones that came out. The one I had was Crawler in the Mist.
I'm actually. I'm in the middle. Well, I don't have that. I have this one.
Oh, you have that one. So this album includes Crawler of the Mist and one of the other ones, one of the other Power Records. They combined it for this larger album.
That's right. So this has Jewel of the Ages, The Shadow of the Stolen City, Thunderdust, and The Crawler in the Mist. And I'm just about to. I have a video released, ready for release on this, and I'm doing this crazy deep dive into Crawler of the Mists.
Oh, that's awesome.
Comparing PR 31. So that's the 45 with the comic book.
Yes. And that's what I had. With art by Neil Adams, by the way.
That's right.
Right. Art by Neil Adams. At 6 years old, of course, that meant nothing to me other than it looked cool. And I recall the voice of the narrator, was, really, it was really good. I actually just recently went back and listened to it again on YouTube, just to kind of bring back that nostalgia. And, the voice, it sounds like what you would expect Conan to sound like, the guy that did that. And I forget who the voice actor was now. I know growing up, I was a big fan of the Filmation, Tarzan and Flash Gordon and all of those. And the guy that did the voice of all those in Thundar was Robert Ridgely.
Okay.
The guy that does this Conan record, it's not Robert Ridgely, but he's got that sound, right? Like as a kid, like that's what a hero sounds like, was that Robert Ridgely type voice. But that was my introduction. I was in 100%. I was so fascinated by it. At right around that age, there were several things I think that kind of sucked me into fantasy, horror, science fiction, really early. That was one. That Filmation Tarzan animated series too was, right around that time, with the kind of a similar vibe. There's a lot of crossover between Edgar Rice Burroughs fans and Robert E. Howard fans, of course. The Hobbit animated cartoon by Rankin Bass too was about that time. So all of these things were kind of moments for me that kind of got me really sucked into fantasy and dark fantasy in particular, I think, and some of those kind of tropes. And before too long, I was reading the regular comics and eventually the books. In those days, the Conan books that were available when I was a kid we were past the Lancer era. It was the Ace reprints with the black covers, with the still mostly with Frazetta covers, a few Boris Vallejo covers. But obviously those were the versions edited by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter with some of their own pastiche editions, and with the stories rearranged in a internal chronological order, according to de Camp, sort of following the career of Conan to kind of turn it into sort of an epic story, which was not really, Howard's intent, but, as a kid, I loved it. I read them over and over. My paperbacks were falling apart after a few years because I read them over and over and over again. Eventually the Arnold movie came out. That was, in 82. I did not see it in the theater. I was too young to see it in the theater, but I saw it when it came on HBO not long after that. We had HBO and, at an early age. So that's when I saw it. And again, watched it over and over and over again. And yeah, it wasn't quite the same Conan as in the books, but, when you're 10, 11 years old, who cares? It's the coolest thing ever, and it's still a great film, even if it's not necessarily Howard's Conan, it's a, very different vision, Milius's vision. It's still such a great film, and, that got me into the character 100%,
So while thinking of the Conan film, and I haven't seen it addressed anywhere yet. I mean, people are kind of dancing around it. I think we saw issue 11, and we saw Jim's amazing reveal, the Atlantean sword.
Right. I think it's safe to say it now. Everybody's probably read it by now, right?
I think so. I just haven't seen any discussion on Reddit or anywhere yet.
I mean, I think most people are cool with it. That was 100% Jim's idea. He was having some fun. Let's put it in there as an Easter egg. Why not? When he first pitched it to me, he's like, "Okay, you're going to be pissed." Like, no, probably not. And he's like, "Okay, I want to do." I'm like, "It's fine." I was a little like, "Yeah, do we want to do that?" But you know what? It's okay. It's fun, and so. A little bit of context, right? For many years, there was a movement. There was kind of the Howard Purist movement,
right?
Something I was very much a part of as well. And, that was an attempt to really lobby to get the pure, unedited Robert E. Howard versions of the stories out in print. And for many years, that wasn't possible because de Camp sort of controlled necessarily control the rights to them, but it's complicated, but for the most part, only the de Camp edited versions were available for many, many years, decades even. And there was a very strong sort of backlash against anything that wasn't pure Robert E. Howard for the longest time. But finally, after DeCamp died, essentially, there was then a movement to get the Howard texts out there. They are available now. All the Conan stories are available in, the Del Rey versions, the pure Howard texts, fragments, synopses, everything is there. Those are basically the authoritative versions. So I feel like now, that battle's won, and we don't need to be so nitpicky about it. We can have a little bit of fun. We can do pastiches now, because all the Howard stuff is out there and it's not going away. And so I'm much more open to things like this. Like, it's okay. Let's have some fun with it now,
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was, I don't know. I think of all the pastiche as, legends told over time. They might not be true, but it's like, think about all these disparate villages that have heard the rumblings of this hero. And it's just, it's that oral tradition that gets bastardized over time. And that's what we get out of it. And
it's like Star Wars Legends or, Elseworlds kind of, stories or whatever, and that's fun. So I'm cool with it. He's having some fun. And I think a lot of people liked it. And it doesn't necessarily mean anything, no need to go reading much into it, And truth is, the Atlantean sword has actually appeared multiple times in the comics over the years, with just artists that just threw it in there. I was actually looking at a Bob Larkin cover from a mid-'80s Savage Sword the other day, and he's wielding the Atlantean sword on the cover, except he's wielding it like one-handed, and it's kind of awkward looking and weird, but so it's been out there, it's been out there before. Other people have done it. Just a fun Easter egg.
Yeah. So how did you get involved with heroic signatures? Tell us that story.
Oh, goodness. Okay. So, I started getting involved in doing, Howard scholarship, probably 15, 16 years ago, something like that. I got, I was just a fan, participating in some of the chat boards online and things like that. But what I did notice is that Howard was making use of a lot of elements of early archaeology and anthropology, stuff that I knew about. And I understood what he was using in a lot of his world building that a lot of others that were writing about Howard and kind of critiquing his work weren't getting, because they didn't have that background that I had. And so I started writing about that online, and eventually I was invited to become a guest blogger on one of the bigger blogs at the time, the Sumerian. It's kind of a legendary blog now in the early 2000s. So I got on there, and then, next thing I know it, I'm giving papers at academic conferences on Robert E. Howard and writing peer-reviewed articles, like who knew, it became kind of my side gig for a while. And, I really got into it and started pushing. I was one of several people that was really pushing hard for getting Howard into academic discussions. There is a large academic community that works on science fiction, horror, and fantasy, the speculative fiction genres. But Howard has pretty much been left out of those discussions. Lovecraft was being talked about. S.T. Joshi's been, doing a lot of great work getting Lovecraft out there, but Howard had kind of been left behind. And so all through the 2000s, I was part of a movement to get Howard out there, in the academic world, along with, a few other people. Going to the Popular Culture Association conference and giving papers there. Eventually I became the area chair for pulp studies at PCA, at the Pop Culture Association conference. I contributed to a number of volumes and writing articles and book chapters. I co-edited a academic collection of essays on Weird Tales, which was, of course, the pulp magazine that Howard, Lovecraft, and Clark Ashton Smith, all those guys wrote for back in the 20s and 30s. So I became one of the leading sort of academic voices on Howard. And, from there, I met Fred Malmberg at Howard Days. Gosh, I think it was probably the year before the Momoa movie came out. So around 2010, 2011, something like that, for the first time. And, I just from that, I started interacting with them over the years, but it was more just casual, but they'd ask me every now and then questions here and there, about things. My name got put out there every now and then when they were looking for a Howard expert, for video games or, RPGs or whatever. They would forward them to me a lot of times. One of my bigger consulting gigs was, as sort of the Howard expert for the Modiphius role-playing game. That was a big one. They brought me in and, I was kind of the leading Howard expert in there, reading all the content, editing everything, trying to keep it as close to Howard's vision as possible. But there've been some other projects, that I've worked on. There's things that I worked on that were incredibly cool, but never came to fruition, and I can't talk about them, and it sucks. That I really wish had happened, but it was more of an informal relationship for a while, or more of a gig relationship, like, hey, can you come in and be a consultant on this? But once, they sort of retooled, and, Heroic Signatures was created out of the, when it was Paradox and Cabinet were the companies that owned the rights. They were sold to Funcom, and then Heroic Signatures was formed, with Fred, still as president or CEO. They brought me in just to be a part of some of the new publishing endeavors that they were going to be doing, both prose and comics. I've been doing some art direction behind the scenes, working on an art Bible, things like that, trying to get the look right, which has been great because it's allowed me to, I hate to use the word correct, right? But, a lot of things have crept into the Conan canon over the years, pastiche stuff that is not at all, part of Howard's vision, what he was trying to do. And, well, obviously it's awfully presumptuous to, to presume to speak for Howard, somebody who's been dead for almost 90 years. I think there are a few of us that have gone deep with Howard, read all of the letters backwards and forwards, getting as much into his mind as possible. Maybe even more importantly, one of the things I've done a lot of is read a lot of the books that Howard's read, a lot of the pulp magazines that Howard's read. That's a lot of what I've done to try and get back into as close as I can to his mindset, right? What were the things that were influencing him and inspiring him, right? We'll never be perfect. We're always going to make mistakes, but I think you've got to try and do that in order to, if you want to try and capture that spirit of what Howard was trying to do when you're creating new material.
So what kind of inconsistencies would you see, like, in the older representations?
Here's a fun one: the Aquaromians.
Okay.
The idea that the Aquilonians are basically a Hyborian version of the Roman Empire.
Right.
Not at all what Howard was doing. If you read the text closely, their technology was very much medieval Europe. They have plate mail and knights and crossbows. I mean, they're not Roman. There are some thematic elements to them that have similarities with the Roman Empire, sort of the imperialism and things like that. But what throws most people off are the names. Many of the names are Greco-Roman sounding, right? People have classical names, like Prospero and stuff like that. But actually, most of those names are taken from Shakespeare.
Right.
That's what he was, for the most part, right? So, except with a few exceptions. But culturally, it's really more of a medieval Western Europe, type society, culturally, aesthetically, technologically. I often tell people, okay, if you really want an analog, a stand-in, a modern version of what Aquilonia and Nemedian and the other Hyborian kingdoms are, think Westeros. That's a closer model. It's not even really a coincidence. George R.R. Martin was a big Howard fan and heavily influenced by Howard. So, that's a big one. I'll throw this out there. One I'm cringing over right now is Oranjune, the City of Thieves.
Okay.
It just slipped it by in issue 11, and I saw it and I cringed. I texted Jim. I was like, Jim, don't ever use Orange again. That was an invention of DeCamp.
Okay.
I think that he didn't like the fact that it seemed like Howard did not give a name to the city of thieves, and so he felt like he had to give it a name. But it does have a name. It is Zamora. Right. Zamora is the name of the city as well as the name of the kingdom. And we know this from a letter that Howard wrote to Clark Ashton Smith when he's describing the story of the Tower of the Elephant. And he talks about, the towers of Zamora the Accursed. It's clear in context that that's the name of the city. But every now and then, Orangeune will still slip back in because everyone read those paperbacks, those DeCamp paperbacks. We all read them growing up. And that was kind of imprinted in our brains that Orangeune is the name of the city of thieves. So yeah, there were strongly worded emails, no more Orangeune. That one slipped by me, because I only saw the plot for that one. I didn't see the script, but and I think it may be in actually the new John Hawking book too. So just pretend you don't see that. Just replace it with Zamora.
Gotta go with it. So as far as the current state, then, I mean, there was one question that a viewer had shared. Sure. What, if any, story elements in the first 3 arcs may have you contributed to? What ideas, if any, were yours? Sure. And does it happen in that context? Like, what's the idea room, I guess? What's the conversation?
It's almost hard to like pick out who does what, right? I mean, there's so much brainstorming. And to be honest, I have very little input at the front end. It's mostly on the back end. After things are out, I'll look at stuff and be like, oh, hey, maybe you might want to tweak this or something. So most of it, I know some people were wondering if the Black Stone, Khan's using the Black Stone as the sort of MacGuffin that that intertwines everything together was my idea. Almost like the Lochnar from Heavy Metal. This. But no, I believe that was Matt Murray, actually, the original line editor that came up with that. So I want to throw that out there because multiple people have been asking me that. One thing that was mine was the idea of the Pictish short sword that Conan finds, having that be the blade from Brule's spear, right? Converted into a short sword later. Originally, it was just they had this Pictish sword, and it's like, I don't know, Picts don't really have swords. What if here's that because they wanted it to be Brule's sword from way back, like why not, you're making it a short sword anyway, why not just make it, that's the blade. It's been repurposed as a sword, but originally it was, Brule's spear, and that ties in with him anyway, right, with the Spear Slayer thing. So that one was mine. The Brissa being a Ligurian was mine. That one caused a little bit some kerfluffles online a little bit. Why is Brissa? Why is she hot? And
seemingly civilized, right? It's like, oh, she's on horseback. She's
right. It's all of these things, right? She doesn't look like a Hyborian age pick. She doesn't look, dress, act. She's riding a horse. All these things, right? So, had to come up with an explanation for that. And I forget now, because a lot of this at the time I was mostly talking with Matt, and I don't know how much was Matt and how much was Jim, piecing all this together. But when they pitched it to me, I was kind of like, that's going to be hard you got to have a way to explain that. And that was sort of my, they're like, hey, we need to do this because it matters for the story that we're trying to tell. So you got to find, how can we do this in canon so that it doesn't conflict? And so that's where I suggested using the Ligurian model, which is kind of an obscure thing from a Howard. It was really just 2 synopses. Wolves Beyond the Border, which was a Hyborian age story where Conan doesn't appear at all. It takes place on the Pictish Aquilonian frontier, while Conan is in the middle of overthrowing the Aquilonian king. And so Conan is referenced off page, but he doesn't actually appear in the story. And in there's this race of people that in one of the synopses he calls them Ligurians, and the other one he calls them Sokandagas. But they're sort of they're culturally Pictish, but they seem to be more akin to Hyborians. It's kind of unclear what Howard was trying to do with them. I actually just wrote an essay for a fanzine, kind of breaking it down even further than I did in my comic essay. But it seemed like, hey, why don't we do this, and we can make her part of the line of Brule, which I think that was probably Jim's idea, making her a descendant of Brule, an ancestor of Bran. This idea that there's this one Pictish line that didn't devolve like the others. But it was my idea to link him with the Ligurians, Howard's Ligurians, which is a pretty obscure, thing. But that was one of mine. Trying to come up with a way to explain what they needed for their story, make it fit with Howard's canon.
Right. Yeah, there was a lot of heavy lifting in that first arc, and I mean, I think when it was released, I think fans were looking for a reason to not like it. I think there was a bit of a distaste from some of the Marvel stuff. And I enjoyed a lot of that stuff. You get Conan and it's fine.
Right.
But I do think people were kind of on edge and they really wanted to scrutinize something. And there was a lot of work done in those first few issues. And and your essays really were, I think, instrumental to, kind of assuaging people's fears. Just kind of, okay, like
Thank
this is
you. I appreciate that.
this is where we are. And and those highlights, or those, I should say, those essays have been a highlight for me. Like with each issue, you feel like you're getting just something extra. Like, okay, here's the adventure. It's over. There's another good cliffhanger. Right. And then there's something to look forward to that's just going to kind of fill in the blanks, right?
Well, I really do appreciate that. I know that a lot of people don't read the back matter in comics,
I say nonsense. They do.
And that's okay. Yeah, the ones that do, cool, it's there for you. It's like a little something extra, and I try, I'm always an advocate for Robert E. Howard's original stories, even as I'm participating in pastiche work, right? But that's one of the things that I try to do with all of the essays is tie everything back to Howard's works, Howard's original works. Because there's a lot of people that are, coming to the characters through the comic now for the first time. They probably haven't read the Howard stories. Maybe they've seen the movie, but a lot of younger readers, may not have even seen the Arnold movie, something that, graybeards like us, take for granted, So, that's what I'm trying to do is tie things back into the original stories. I always want to point people back to the original stories and hope that, some of them will actually go and read them and maybe get hooked and maybe move on beyond Conan and read some of the other great characters that, that Howard has, Solomon Kane and Cull and Bran McMorn,
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's the challenge right now. And I hope the comic is bridging that gap. It's just the younger audience. And I don't know what the numbers are. I only know what the numbers are from the demographics that watch my video. And I assume there's an algorithm that sends it out to, about 50-year-olds. And that's who's watching my video on a bell curve, right? Yeah. So hopefully younger readers are picking it up and saying, what's this? I know there's one person I interact with, Hobbies of a Man, and he's a younger guy. I think he's in his 20s. And so that's nice to see. I know he's into manga and but here's something. So I do see, there are younger people putting videos out there, and I guess it's
Oh, I love his show. I've been commenting on his show. He actually mentioned his last one. He's in Texas. He may try and come to Howard Days next weekend, and I try to encourage him. Please come. You absolutely should come to Howard Days. So
that's my bucket list. Maybe next.
Listen, let me plug this. You need to come to Howard Days, man. You need to come and do a live show from Howard Days. That's what you need to do. I don't know. The internet's not that great there. Maybe not live.
Some sort of satellite connection. Yeah, I would love to check that out. I don't want to get too off topic, but I know you guys are going to be there next week. When is it? It's June 7th, June 8th?
Yeah, June 7th, 8th. It's usually the second weekend in June every year. For those that may not be aware, Howard Days is a little small con that's put on every year in Robert E. Howard's hometown of Cross Plains, Texas. It started in 1986 with about 6 or 7 people. It wasn't even intended to be an annual thing. It was members of a fan group called Rehupa, the REH United Press Association, REH UPA. that's a kind of a dinosaur, type of fan activity that, a lot of people don't even know about it, anymore. Amateur press associations used to be a big thing, even in Howard and Lovecraft's time. They were both members of amateur press associations in the 20s and 30s. Ray Hoopa is still around. I'm still a member. We do paper zines and with snail mail, these archaic, ways of interacting with each other. But that was who started it. It was members of Ray Hoopa in the 80s, and they showed up there in Howard's hometown, much to the surprise and probably chagrin of the local rural Texas community that, saw all these, weird Conan fans just strolling into town, and it was people like Bill Cavalier, who's, going to be there this weekend. Rusty Burke, who's really the preeminent Robert E. Howard scholar. Nancy Collins, the author, wrote the Sonia Blue stories, wrote for Swamp Thing for many years. She was just a fan in those days. Was one of the first people to show up there. And so every year it's grown. Robert E. Howard's house has been turned into a museum. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. There's a pavilion there next door to it where everybody hangs out. It's not so much like a regular con. It's more like a retreat in a lot of ways, because it is really in the middle of nowhere. It's hard to get to. You can't just fly to Cross Plains. You got to fly to Dallas and rent a car and drive for 2 hours and, just to even get there. It truly is a pilgrimage. It's a Hajj, to try and, make it there. And so once you're there, it's you and the guests, everybody, you're all stuck there for the weekend together, hanging out, drinking Shiner Box, swapping lies, having a good time, and it's, there's really nothing like it. There's no other fan experience that I've ever been a part of that's like it. It's almost more like a family reunion every year in a lot of ways. Right. And every year we get new family members that come and join us, it's a good time. Panels, there's some dealers, there's a banquet. It's a weird mix too of the local culture, right? This tiny little small town here in Texas that, quite frankly, has not changed very much since Howard lived there in a lot of ways. The population has probably shrunk. There's two political parties in town, the Baptists and the Methodists, and it's, it's really, rural Texas. But it gives you a feel for, what it would have been like for Howard, growing up there with his imagination and, probably, being an odd duck, compared to some of the other folks around there. Most of the men worked in the oil fields or they were farmers or whatever, and he's writing stories, right, which was a little weird. Yet he was making more money than probably just about anybody in town at his peak,
Sorry, but it's just the erudition, right? So, I mean, sure, I've read, not all the Conan stuff, but of the, the essentials, all the main Conan stories. Mm-hmm. And I've just started the El Borak. But it's the erudition. Yeah. Like you can't believe that this guy from this small town is writing this stuff. And I mean, there's a feeling that it's of an age, that predates the current one anyway, where literacy and communicating via the written word I feel like it's not the same as it was, in the 30s, say. Yeah. But it's
you have this rural guy in the middle of Texas that seems more literate, more well-read than most people growing up in cities and urban environments today. Yeah.
It's just wild.
Well, and he had to work for it. He had to order books by mail, right? I mean, he had to. It was hard, He was an autodidact. He was, for the most part, self-taught. There was a couple of small libraries around. There's a small, Howard Payne University, a little small college had a library, and he would, borrow books from there. And he and his friends would swap books. They would order books and they would trade them. And it was a challenge. You had to work to be able to be that well read in rural Texas in the 1920s and 30s, and he did.
So I assume that the town embraces the event now, or do they still look upon everybody as the weirdos?
Depends on who you ask.
I'm sure there's a bit of both.
It's a bit of both, right?
Crossplay.
100%. There are some people that completely embrace it, And there's others that remind me of, the old Hobbit woman in the Fellowship of the Ring. That's all just like, when you come into town, just kind of staring you down. It's a bit of both. Certainly it brings a lot of business into the community, for 1 weekend a year. They have there's a local kind of arts and crafts festival that goes on at the same time, which they used to call the Barbarian Fest, to kind of piggyback on it a little bit. I think they changed the name now, but it certainly it's more welcoming than it ever has been, than it was in the mid 1980s when the first guy showed up there. First folks showed up. 100%.
What wares will you be bringing to sell, and what will you be looking to purchase?
Oh, that's a great.
I know Jim said.
Yeah, I've got some duplicate Weird Tales issues. I'm going to bring some pulps to sell. I've got some rare ones. I've got one really rare fanzine that I'll probably be trying to sell or trade. That one may be better as trade bait. It's a 1936 copy of the Phantograph, which was the first appearance of Howard's Hyborian Age essay. Oh, okay. Which is incredibly rare. Some of the one of my favorite things to collect are the fanzines from the 1930s, the science fiction and fantasy fanzines. They're so rare, rare as hen's teeth, because these were that first generation of pulp fans. That's really all that we do today. The cons and the huge fandoms that we have with comics and science fiction and fantasy and all of this. All of it goes back to this first generation of pulp fans in the 1920s and 30s that were doing fanzines. That was kind of the first real fan activity. And, everything comes from that. There's that first generation of fans are people whose names many people would recognize. They were teenagers reading these pulp magazines and writing letters to each other and doing all that. But it's people like Jerry Weist, who went on to be one of the creators of Superman in a few years. Julie Schwartz and Mort Weisinger, who became editors at DC. Forrest Ackerman, who went on to do Famous Monsters of Filmland, the magazine for monster kids, in the 60s and 70s. It was it's a fascinating time, and Howard, Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, they were interacting with all of these fans. Howard was giving stories to these guys, to publish in their fanzines. If it didn't sell it Weird Tales, like Frost Giant's Daughter. It's a great example. One of the, now it's one of the classic Conan stories, but it was rejected by Farnsworth Wright at Weird Tales. Howard reworked it and changed Conan's name to Amra, which, all the fans that were reading, they would have known who that was, and gave it to one of these fans, Charles Hornig, who published it in his little fanzine, Fantasy Fan, and it was published as Gods of the North, right? So it's a Conan story with the serial numbers filed off. And these little paper things, they're so tiny. They're like these little tiny things, and they were mimeographed and stapled, and they're so fragile. And, they probably, in most cases, only printed, in the dozens of copies of these. And so very few of them survive. So some of these, Howard's stories first appeared in some of these fanzines, some of his poems, things like that. And there may only be a handful of copies still in existence. Wow. So just having one of those, man, it's a treasure. It's cool. So I'll have one of those for sale. That's a super rare one. I've got most of those. I've got the Gods of the North issue, Fantasy Fan issue. That's a really rare one. Probably the biggest though is the Hyborian Age, fanzine that was put together in 1938. It was the first time the whole essay was published for the first time and complete, along with the first time a Hyborian Age map was published. And it was after Howard's death, but it was a fanzine put together basically as a tribute to Howard after his death. It had, it had a piece by Lovecraft in there. Lovecraft had also just died, but it's put together by Forrest Ackerman and Donald J. Wollheim, another one of these fans who went on to become a publisher, the founder of Daw Books. If you remember the Daw paperbacks, back in the day, that's Donald A. Wollheim's initials, DAW. I've got a copy of that. I've actually got Glenn Lord's copy of that. That's probably my greatest treasure out of these collectibles. That one I won't be selling, but I've got a few others that I'm going to be selling, some pulps, things like that. I got a couple of copies of Conan #1, a couple of high grade copies of that I may take to sell and see. So some fun stuff. I'll have some good stuff. I'm bringing some cool stuff to sell this year.
And will you acquire anything, or do you have everything, or you just?
The one big thing I don't have, I've got almost everything. The one big thing I don't have is the first edition of A Gent from Bear Creek.
Okay, what's that?
Okay, so this is one of the grails of Howard collecting. Along with that Hyborian Age, one thing I was telling you about. So, A Gent from Bear Creek is the first book of just all Robert E. Howard material. It's his only published novel, or it's the first published novel, basically. It was published by Herbert Jenkins in Great Britain in 1937, so just after his death. There were several attempts from the British publisher to publish one of Howard's novels. Hour of the Dragon was originally intended to be published over there, and they ended up falling through. So instead, they published. It's a novel of Breckinridge Elkins, one of his humorous Western characters of all things. And the novel is basically he took some of his Breckinridge Elkins short stories and kind of cobbled them together into a novel. Honestly, kind of like what Hour of the Dragon is, right? Hour of the Dragon is a couple of his Conan stories kind of cobbled together and reworked a little bit, right? Because it was going to a different market, and it's extremely rare. I forget now what the count is. I think they're up to about 20 known copies in existence. Most of them were destroyed during World War II. Most of them didn't survive the war and the paper drives and the Blitz and all of that. There's only one copy with the dust jacket that survives. And it was August Derleth's copy. Derleth was another part of the Lovecraft circle. And Derleth signed it, and he gave it to Glenn Lord, the longtime executor of Howard's estate. And now Patrice Luenay, a friend and colleague of mine over in France, who's his collection blows mine away. He's got that copy. I'm always happy to just get Patrice's leavings. That makes, I'm perfectly happy with that. When he upgrades, sometimes I'll get a shot to buy his undercopy, of stuff. So, that's fine.
He's not going to upgrade that one. So you're SOL.
Yeah, that one, exactly. So that's one I don't have. I don't have a Gent from Bear Creek. I got my eye on one though. I know where one is. So we'll see. So these things take patience.
Yeah, that's an adventure in itself.
Mm-hmm.
And now you had mentioned, I know an email, I guess a number of years ago, that you had done a dig on the Howard property. I was curious to hear about that.
Yeah, I did. That was a weird. That was talking about worlds colliding, right? Yeah. My career and my kind of side gig coming together. So we were. It was at Howard Days one year. I guess it was probably 2017, 2018, right in there. I forget what year it was now. And at the time, I worked for the National Park Service. As an archaeologist there, and the program I ran there was called the Archaeological Assistance Program. And we did work outside of parks, helping out, other agencies or local communities with, their National Register sites and things like that. Since the Park Service manages the National Register of Historic Places in the United States. So we were out there at Howard Days one year, just sitting out at the pavilion, and a couple of older guys come strolling up, and they're talking to us. And it turns out that they used to live in the house in the 1970s when they were teenagers. They moved in the late 60s, something like that. They were kids or teenagers, and they were talking. So we're quizzing. I'm like, oh, wow, tell us about it, And they're talking, and they're like, yeah. And right over there, right there was a cellar there behind the house, And of course, there's nothing there now but grass, right? And we're like, really? There's a cellar? Nobody knew about this. And like, yeah, it was full of all kinds of junk and stuff. There's no telling what all is in there. We just filled it all up and covered it up because, we were afraid of rattlesnakes. We're like, what? So there's stuff in there? Oh yeah, all kinds of stuff. There's no telling what's in there. Like, yeah, if you knew somebody that could like excavate or dig it out, no telling what you could find. And all of a sudden, 50 heads all turned, looked at me. I was like, well, yeah, let me think about this. The house is on the National Register. Literally part of my job is to do archaeological work for, National Register sites. I might actually be able to do this as part of my day job. Right. And so I did. We had to find funding. We worked with a nonprofit that did a GoFundMe to get some funds to cover, my salary was covered, but I had to cover, my staff and travel and stuff like that. So, came up, people donated money and, got t-shirts and, so we, put it together and we did it. I used ground penetrating radar, did a geophysical survey of the area. We found the cellar using that. Also found the location of where the old garage, there was an old separate garage that was there on the property. We didn't, kind of knew where it was. We didn't know exactly where it was, but I found that with the GPR. But yeah, we excavated it, with some of my staff there from NPS. It was an official National Park Service project. It was in, Archaeology magazine, it was, went viral for a while there. Lots of media attention on it. And, honestly, going into it, I didn't have high expectations. We didn't really know what, it's a cellar. What are you going to find? Probably a bunch of mason jars, right? But it was also an opportunity to, it was more of a public outreach opportunity to teach people about archaeology because it generated a lot of interest. We had volunteers that came out and that was what was really cool about it. Showing people how real archaeology works. And we did that and we excavated and we found, one of the coolest things that it went viral and freaked everybody out. We found this tiny little miniature double-headed battle axe. And if you Google the dig now, you'll see images of this everywhere. This little double-headed battle axe. And we're like, are you kidding me? Like, really? We found a battle axe in Robert E. Howard's, cellar, root cellar, storm cellar, whatever this is. And so that went viral. We're like, what in the world is this thing? And eventually we got it back and did the analysis on it, and it was a frog pelvis. But for a while there, it was pretty cool. That was a sort of like mascot artifact from our dig. But we did fully excavate it. It was quite a project, and it was very cool. We got this brick lined cellar. Of course, what we did find was, as I suspected, a whole lot of mason jars, exactly like what you would expect. Some of them with the content still in it, though, which was pretty cool. Still sealed up after decades. We did find a few early 20th century medical items, like a little medicine bottle and some little, glass tubing, part of a syringe, metal syringe, things like that may have been associated with the Howard family. For those who don't know, Robert E. Howard's father was a traveling country doctor. He was the local doctor. So finding those medical supplies, that was probably, from Doc Howard's, Howard's father's, his medical supplies. So that was kind of cool. Nothing that we could directly tie to Howard himself, but certainly a few items that were probably from that period or a little later. But it was a neat thing, and more importantly, it's part of the house that nobody knew existed, part of the structure. For safety reasons, they did fill it back in. But today the outline of it is marked out with railroad ties, and it's been turned into like kind of a flower bed sort of thing in the shape of the cellar. So you can see where it is and you can at least, visualize it. So one of the things I'll be doing at Howard Days, I'll be giving a little, talk about the dig and everything there at the house as part of the tour.
Yeah, I mean, it must feel gratifying. Like it just gives you a personal connection to the site now, and it just extend, yeah. Well, I mean, and connecting to that involvement and extending your involvement. I know you had some exciting news about issue number 4 of the Savage Sword of Conan.
I do. I can talk about it now that the solicitor on it. Yeah, I can actually talk about it. At least I can't go into details, but I can say, I'm doing my first. This will be my debut as a comic book writer, not just writing essays. I'm actually writing a comic story that will be in Savage Sword 4. So I think we already know it's kind of been announced that Savage Sword 4 will be a special issue that ties in with the Blackstone event that's going to be going on along, just like the Free Comic Book Day issue. And the Blackstone mini series. It's going to be coming out later this summer. So it will. And I've had several people already complaining about it's just like Marvel and DC with the crossover events. You got to buy everything. You don't necessarily need to. They'll be standalone stories, but they will, give added context, let's say, to the overall story. And it's a chance to showcase again some of Howard's other characters. That's what's kind of exciting about it. My story is Conrad and Kirowan. So Howard's sort of a cult archaeologist, right? So it's not too much of a stretch for me, hopefully. It's kind of.
I know you had posted something the other day, and their first appearances. Where was that? It was in Marvel. Right?
Yeah, it was in Marvel. It was in Journey into Mystery, the second Journey into Mystery series, not the Atom Age and Silver Age series that Thor appeared in. Marvel relaunched Journey into Mystery in the early 70s, 1972 in the first issue, and it was. It was Dig Me No Grave was the Robert E. Howard story that was adapted there. And it's got Conrad and Kirowan in there. John Conrad and John Kirowan, but they changed Kirowan's first name to Dan, I guess, because they didn't want two Johns, got to be honest. Howard wasn't super imaginative sometimes with his first names. But yeah, they're basically sort of the occult detective trope. Kind of 1930s versions of John Constantine, that kind of idea for those that might be familiar with that kind of character. They're very much Lovecraftian stories, the Conrad and Kirowan stories. It was Howard trying to do Lovecraftian stories, but because it's Howard, his Lovecraftian stories tended to have a lot more action. His protagonists, when they encounter some sort of eldritch cosmic horror, rather than curling up in a fetal position and going insane like Lovecraft characters would, gibbering on the floor, Howard's characters fight back. They shoot. They they may still end up things may go to a dark place. They may go south quickly, but his characters tend to fight back against that for the most part. But he's really good at writing that type of horror. And for those that have not really delved into Howard's horror stories, I highly recommend it. The Del Rey Horror Stories of Robert E. Howard collection is fantastic. Not just for his Lovecraftian stories, but some of his other horror stories as well. Highly recommended. They're underrated, I think, his horror. But they shouldn't be, right? Because at the end of the day, sword and sorcery, in a lot of ways, is, it's not sentimental Tolkien-like fantasy, right? Sword and sorcery is horror at its root. It's horror mixed with, pulp adventure, swashbuckling adventure, right? So it shouldn't be too much of a surprise that his horror stories are really good.
So what was the challenge for you with generating a comic script? Is it something you've always kind of imagined doing? Is it?
Yeah.
Did it come out easily, I guess?
Well, I mean, I've dabbled in prose fiction, and I've edited fiction. I edited a fiction, weird fiction magazine for a while, Skelos, with Mark Finn and Chris Gruber. And I've dabbled a little bit, and I sort of wrote some fiction for the Modifius role-playing game in the voice of Kirowan. Kind of in character. I wrote some things for that. So I sort of felt comfortable, with those characters writing the prose style. But the challenge then was to, translate what I'm thinking of in my head as a prose narrative translate that into sequential art, right? And getting into the visual storytelling that you can do in the comic form, right? Even though I've been a comic reader my whole life, right? And so intellectually I get it, right? But once you really try to do that and you're trying to, you envision, how is this going to look on the page? And you got to think cinematically, and you've got to, it's cinematic, but yet it's static images, right? And so how do you capture movement? How do you do those things? How do you think about page turns and things like that, right? You want to do that, have this here so that you turn the page, you got a big reveal, those kinds of things that you don't normally think about. And I will say Jim Zub was a tremendous help here. I had a lot of guidance from Jim. And, I feel like my first draft for a newbie, I think I did okay. I've read all, I've read all the books and stuff on how to do it. I try, but Jim came in with suggestions. I'm like, oh yeah, damn crap. Yeah, that's way better. Why don't you do this? Why don't you, think about this? Oh man. Yes. 100%. So yeah, Jim was a huge help. I mean, he was, he had, there's a lot of editorial guidance from Jim. Chris Butera, the editor too, had some good suggestions as well. It's just a short story, right? It's just a 10-pager. These are all short ones. And so that was actually a challenge. I had an idea for a narrative, but, with 10 pages, it's not like you get a whole 3-act story in there, right? It's tricky. You don't have a lot to work with. I think I did pull off 3 acts, but barely. So that was a challenge, trying to get everything in there. I'll say this. I don't want to talk. Tell you what, I'll give a little hint about what it's about, sort of, without giving anything away. One of the things I wanted to do, there is one of Robert E. Howard's sort of Lovecraftian horror stories. It's not a Conrad and Kirowan story. It's a couple of other characters, but it's in that vein. There's a story that he wrote that's a fragment that is criminally overlooked, mostly because it's a fragment. He started writing this story and he gave up halfway through, right? You'll find it in the Del Rey Horror Stories collection at the very end, with the title Unnamed Fragment. But I always loved where that story was going. And so essentially what I try to do is take that little fragment and kind of do a sequel to it as a Conrad and Kirowan story. And so I'm kind of riffing off of one of Howard's fragments that he, started with a really cool premise, but it didn't really go anywhere and he dropped it halfway through. So that'll give, if anybody wants to go and start digging that out, that'll give them a little something to talk about. Little teaser.
Can you speak to who the artist is that's accompanying your?
Oh, sure. Yes. It's Eric Donovan is the artist. He does great work. Kind of a up and coming talent. He's, he's worked for some of the big two. He's done some John Constantine work, right? So he's done some stuff in that vein, that occult detective vein. And, I literally was just looking at some layouts earlier. It's cool. I'm excited. I may have to buy
it come to life. Well, it must be exciting to see it come to life.
It's exciting. It's really cool to see your vision on the page, right? That's super cool.
Can we expect more?
I'm sorry?
Can we expect more?
Oh, I hope so. I've kind of got the bug now. Yeah, I've got several stories I'd love to do. I'd love to do a Brand McMorn story. I've got it's kind of longer though, so I don't know if I can pull it off, but I've got a Brand McMorn story that's been, bouncing around with the hamster spinning for a long time now that I'd love to get out as a comic. I actually, there's one of the archaeological sites I've been working on for the last few years. It's just an incredible story. It's a historic fort. I would love to retell that story in graphic novel form. That's something I'd like to do at some point. I'd like to, again, have my worlds collide. I think it's a great way to to tell stories, the mix of text and imagery that you get with comics it's a unique medium for storytelling. And, those of us that are, comic fans grew up with it, we get it. It's funny. I was sharing a comic with a friend of mine, fellow archaeologist, and she never read comics growing up. I'm like, what? You've never read comics? And I'm showing her, this comic, and she's looking at it, and she actually struggled to figure out how to read it, which was kind of, it seemed crazy to me. It's the kind of thing we take for granted. She's like, which way do I go? Like this way? Like, how do I, like, wait, really? You didn't read Donald Duck when you were a kid? Like nothing, it's funny. I guess some of us that, that we grew up around comics, we take this stuff for granted, this medium, but, there's so much power in comics. It took many years, I think, where, comics were kind of in the literary gutter, right? They were just for kids or whatever. And every now and then you'd have breakthroughs like EC, where there would be attempts to tell more mature stories, but it wouldn't last, or it was intentionally squashed, It's great that we now, the medium itself has a lot more respect, and you can tell sophisticated stories. You can have your Neil Gaimans and and your Alan Moores out there, really doing incredible storytelling. I think it's no stretch to say that Conan played a role in that, particularly with Savage Sword, right? The black and white magazine phenomenon, of the 70s, of which, Savage Sword of Conan was the flag bearer, did a lot to break that stigma, as a way of getting around the Comics Code Authority, right? So you could tell more mature stories. That was, one of the breakthrough moments, I think, that showed that was possible, and led to things like Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns, and those kinds of things in the mid 80s, So yeah, I think that's just in comics history. I think Savage Sword plays a huge role. Conan had a role in that, I think. So it's kind of cool. Kind of cool that it's all coming full circle. I love it.
Yeah, there's been so many comments floating around recently that obviously there's a bias, that I have, but there does feel that maybe it's a period of renewal.
Yeah, Conan. Yeah, there was, people talk about just, for Robert E. Howard and Conan and these characters, the late 60s and 70s was kind of seen as the golden age, that the Howard boom, they called it, right? And you got something like a silver age in the early 2000s, with the Del Rey text coming out, the Age of Conan video game. The character, it didn't have the same level of popularity it had in the 70s and 80s, but there was something of a boom in the early 2000s too, which ultimately led to the Momoa movie, and it wasn't successful, but that was kind of the culmination of that early 2000s boom. I think we're starting a new one. It feels that way. It really truly feels that way. And the comics are leading the way. The Marvel comics led the way with the original boom. The Dark Horse comics, helped in the early 2000s. I think that was a large part of that. And now the Titan comics seem to be doing that as well. Conan Exile's video game is still doing well. It's been around for a few years, but they're just doing a new revamp of that. We're talking about younger people coming to the character.
Yeah.
Here's what I'm discovering. You're getting a lot of Zennials, a lot of 20-somethings are coming to the character through the Conan Exiles video game. It's a different medium. When we were kids, we came to it maybe through comics or the Arnold movie or whatever. Video games are a gateway for a lot of the younger generation. It's funny, we were having this conversation with, I think it was Mark Finn, a couple other, Howard guys, talking about the different generations that are into Conan. And we were talking about that. Like, it seems like there are a lot of younger people that are interested in Conan and Howard, that are coming into it. They're coming into the video games, a lot of 20-somethings. And then there's a lot of Gen Xers and older, that from the old days that are into the character because they grew up reading the Lancers, and so there's boomers and there's Gen Xers like me. We're missing millennials, it seems like, and looking back, it's because, there wasn't really anything there in the early 90s late 80s, early 90s, that was a dark time. That was the dark ages for Howard stuff, for that millennial generation, with one exception. And this is fascinating because I hang out on Reddit a lot. I've seen you posted on Reddit recently, right? But
it's new for me, but I figured I'd.
Well, Reddit is very millennial heavy. Most of the Conan fans there, they were all fans of the Conan the Adventurer cartoon in the early 90s.
And that's something that, that's something I don't think I was aware of until maybe last year. I don't think I've ever seen it or heard of it.
I mean, I was vaguely aware of it, but you had so much better stuff like the Batman animated series and the X-Men, animated series, right? It overshadowed it.
Like I was like maybe in university then, so
right? Yeah, I was too. I was at college, although I admit, me and my friends, we still watch the Batman series, even people that
watch Spider-Man, the X-Men, and the around that time.
And right. And Ren and Stimpy. We were definitely all, sitting on the couch with a bong watching Ren and Stimpy in the early 90s. I admit that now. Right. But yeah, there's a whole group of millennials, they're not big. There's not a huge group, but there's a bunch of them that came to it through that Conan the Adventurer cartoon with the dumb little phoenix.
Yeah, I gotta check it out. I've seen the credits Conan or
right.
But I know I've seen so many comments like, oh yeah, I love that. Oh, do you remember that? And I was like, that's cool.
Yeah. So that's cool. I mean, that's our gateway. That's awesome. But yeah, I think there's different it's different media now. Video gaming is for the younger generations has probably replaced comics in a lot of ways. Yeah. And why not? It's an interactive comic in a lot of ways. It's still that visual the mix of the visual and the text, but it's three-dimensional and it's interactive and it's like living inside a comic, so I get it. It's cool. It's fun stuff.
Well, I mean, I think we can end it there. Maybe we'll continue chatting for a bit off camera.
Sure.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely.
I feel like
happy to be here, man. This is great.
Mega fan.
I mean, that's basically what I am, a mega fan. I'm they call me a Howard scholar, and I guess like technically I've done peer-reviewed articles, but at the end of the day, I'm just a fan, just like everybody else, living the dream.
Well, enjoy Howard Days. Send my regards to everybody there.
Will do. Thanks so much. And I better see you there next year.
Thanks for watching, liking, consider subscribing. A very sincere thank you to Jeff Shanks for the generosity of his time. And until next time, take it easy, you Stygian Dogs.